The Vance estate was a world unto itself, a sprawling island of old money and older traditions floating in a sea of modern life. Its heart was the grand ballroom, a cavernous space of polished marble and gilded ceilings where ghosts of laughter from a bygone era seemed to linger in the air. For the past week, this heart had been beating with a frantic, preparatory rhythm. The annual Vance Charity Gala was approaching, and its matriarch, Mrs. Eleanor Vance, demanded nothing short of perfection. Her perfection was a cold, precise thing, measured in the gleam of silverware and the crispness of linen. She moved through the house like a general inspecting her troops, her voice a low, cutting instrument that corrected, chided, and commanded. Her head maid, Sarah, moved with a different kind of precision. It was a quiet, practiced grace, born of 2 decades spent navigating the treacherous currents of the Vance household. She understood the unspoken language of the estate. A tightened jaw from Mrs. Vance meant the flowers were slightly wilted. A tap of a manicured finger meant a speck of dust had been sighted. Sarah's daughter, Alara, had grown up in the shadow of this world. At 18, she possessed her mother's quiet demeanor, but harbored a universe of her own within. She lived in the small, tidy servants' quarters at the back of the estate, a space that smelled of lavender and starch, a stark contrast to the cloying perfume of wealth that permeated the main house. Alara's world had its own heart, and it was the same as the estate's, the grand ballroom. But for her, it wasn't the chandeliers or the tapestries that called to her. It was the magnificent Steinway grand piano that sat enthroned on a low dais in the corner. It was Mrs. Vance's most prized possession, a concert-grade instrument she spoke of as if it were a blood relative. Her own daughter, Victoria, was a pianist, and the gala was meant to be her grand debut into society. Mrs. Vance had been grooming her for this moment since she was a child, curating her talent like one of her prize-winning roses. Alara was forbidden from touching the piano. The rule was as absolute as gravity. That instrument, Mrs. Vance had told her once, catching the then 12-year-old girl gazing at it with longing, is for artists, not for staff. Its keys are meant to be caressed by hands that understand legacy, not hands that scrub floors. The words had stung, leaving a small, invisible scar that ached whenever she was near the instrument. But Alara had a secret. In her small room, tucked under her bed, was a simple 61-key electronic keyboard, a gift from her mother, purchased with a year's worth of carefully saved tips. With a pair of old, crackling headphones, Alara could close her eyes and pretend. The plastic keys were cool, weighted ivory. She would download sheet music on the library computer, her fingers tracing the complex patterns of Chopin, Liszt, and Rachmaninoff. Her mind memorizing what her hands could not yet fully practice. She taught herself in stolen moments, in the deep quiet of the night when the great house was asleep. Her hands, which polished silver and folded napkins by day, learned a different kind of language by night, a language of passion, sorrow, and soaring joy. Her mother, Sarah, would sometimes stand outside her door, listening not to the sound, which was trapped in the headphones, but to the soft, rhythmic tapping of the keys, and the quiet, emotional hums that escaped Alara's lips. Sarah knew her daughter was gifted. It was a truth she held close to her heart, a small, warm light in the often chilly world she inhabited. In the days leading up to the gala, the house was a storm of activity. Victoria Vance could be heard practicing for hours on the Steinway. The chosen piece was Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor, a tempestuous, brilliant work that demanded not just technical skill, but profound emotional depth. From the hallway where she was dusting a grandfather clock, Alara would listen. Victoria's playing was correct. Every note was hit with precision. The timing was impeccable. The dynamics followed the sheet music to the letter. But it was hollow. It was like a perfectly recited poem by someone who didn't understand the words. It had the shape of passion, but not the soul. Alara would close her eyes and hear the music as it was meant to be played, a raging storm, a desperate plea, a triumphant cry. Her fingers would twitch at her sides, itching to show the piano how it was meant to sing. One afternoon, Mrs. Vance swept into the ballroom while Victoria was practicing. She stopped, her head cocked. "No, no, Victoria," she said, her voice sharp. "The crescendo there. It needs more fire. Think of our family's legacy. Think of the power you are projecting. Play it again." Victoria, a girl who had never known a day of true struggle, tried to inject a fire she had never felt. The notes came out louder, but not more powerful. Alara, hidden from view in the adjoining dining room, felt a pang of something she couldn't name: pity, frustration, and a deep, aching longing. She knew the fire that Chopin had written into those notes. It was the fire of a quiet girl who dreamed of a world beyond service, the fire of a mother who sacrificed everything for her child, the fire of a spirit that refused to be defined by its station. The night of the gala arrived. The Vance estate was transformed into a glittering spectacle. Cars worth more than Sarah's lifetime earnings lined the long, winding driveway. Women in shimmering gowns and men in tailored tuxedos drifted through the rooms, their laughter echoing off the high ceilings. Alara and her mother, dressed in their simple black and white uniforms, moved through the crowds like ghosts, offering canapés and refilling champagne flutes. Alara kept her eyes downcast, but her ears took in everything: the snippets of conversation about stock markets and European vacations, the polite but empty compliments, the entire performance of high society. Through it all, a palpable sense of anticipation was building for Victoria's performance. Mrs. Vance had ensured everyone knew this was the evening's centerpiece. She had even secured the attendance of a legend, Mr. Alastair Finch, the notoriously harsh music critic from the London Times, a man whose reviews could build or shatter a career overnight. He was old, with a mane of white hair and eyes that seemed to have seen and heard everything, and he carried an air of weary authority. His presence had turned the pressure on Victoria from a simmer to a boil. Alara watched him from across the room. He wasn't mingling. He stood by a window, a glass of whiskey in his hand, looking profoundly bored. He seemed to see through the glittering facade to the hollow core beneath, and for the first time that night, Alara felt a sense of kinship with one of the guests. Finally, the moment arrived. The conversations died down as Mrs. Vance glided to the dais. "My dear friends," she began, her voice resonating with practiced warmth, "it brings me such joy to welcome you all. Tonight, we celebrate not only our continued support for the Children's Arts Foundation, but also the blossoming of new talent. It is my immense pride to present my daughter, Victoria Vance, performing a masterpiece by Chopin." A wave of polite applause rippled through the room. Victoria, looking pale and nervous in a pale pink gown, walked stiffly to the piano and sat down. She took a deep breath and began to play. The notes of the Ballade No. 1 filled the ballroom. It was exactly as it had been in practice, technically flawless, emotionally sterile. Alara watched the audience. They were attentive, their faces arranged in expressions of pleasant appreciation, but their eyes were distant. They were listening, but they weren't feeling. Then she looked at Mr. Finch. He had one eyebrow slightly raised, his expression unreadable, but far from captivated. He took a slow sip of his whiskey, his gaze fixed on Victoria's hands, as if studying a scientific specimen. The performance ended. A beat of silence, and then applause erupted, loud, dutiful, and brief. Victoria gave a small, trembling curtsy and practically fled from the dais, her face flushed. Mrs. Vance beamed, pretending the reception was thunderous. "Wasn't she just wonderful?" she declared to those around her, her voice a little too loud. It was in that moment of manufactured triumph that chaos intervened. A young, nervous waiter, trying to navigate the crowd, stumbled. A tray of champagne flutes crashed to the marble floor with a sound that was shockingly loud in the refined atmosphere. A collective gasp went through the room. Staff rushed to clean up the mess of glass and golden liquid. The perfectly orchestrated evening had a sudden, messy tear in its fabric, and in that tear, something shifted in Alara. She saw her mother, on her hands and knees, carefully picking up shards of glass, her expression one of mortification. She saw Mrs. Vance, her face a mask of fury at the incompetence of her staff. She saw Victoria, now receiving hollow congratulations, her brief moment in the spotlight already forgotten, and she saw the Steinway, sitting alone on the dais, silent and misused. A righteous anger, hot and clean, surged through her. It wasn't about fame or applause. It was about truth. The truth of the music, the truth of her own soul. Before she was even aware of making a decision, her feet were moving. She walked past the gawking guests, past the frantic staff, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She felt her mother's eyes on her, a silent, panicked plea to stop. She ignored it. She felt Mrs. Vance's gaze, sharp and incredulous. "Elara, what in God's name do you think you're doing?" The whisper was a venomous dart, but Elara didn't even flinch. She reached the dais and stepped onto it. The room, which had been buzzing about the spilled champagne, slowly fell quiet. A new spectacle was unfolding. The maid's daughter, in her plain black uniform, was walking toward the $1 million piano. Whispers turned into a confused, heavy silence. "Get down from there this instant," Mrs. Vance hissed, starting to move toward her, her face a thundercloud of rage. But she was too late. Elara reached the piano. She didn't sit immediately. She stood for a moment and gently, reverently, ran her hand over the polished ebony wood. It felt like coming home. Then, she sat down. Her back was straight, her hands hovered over the keys, and she took one deep, centering breath. And then she began to play. It was the same piece, Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor. But from the very first notes, it was a different universe of sound. The opening was not hesitant, but heavy with a sorrowful question. It was the sound of a lifetime of yearning. Then, the melody began to build. It wasn't just a sequence of notes. It was a story. Elara's story. It was the quiet frustration of being unseen, the fierce, protective love for her mother, the secret joy of her clandestine practice sessions. The music flowed from her not as something she had memorized, but as something she was living. The silence in the room was no longer confused. It was absolute. It was a thick, breathless silence, heavy with astonishment. Everyone, from the wealthiest tycoon to the youngest server, was frozen. Champagne glasses were held halfway to lips. Conversations were abandoned mid-word. Mrs. Vance had stopped dead in her tracks, her mouth slightly agape. The fury on her face was slowly being replaced by a bewildering cocktail of shock and disbelief. Her daughter, Victoria, stood by her side, her face ashen. She was hearing the soul of the music for the first time, and in it, she recognized her own profound lack. Elara's eyes were closed. She was no longer in the Vance ballroom. She was in the music. Her hands danced over the keys with a power and grace that seemed impossible. The furious, passionate passages were a torrent, a storm of emotion unleashed. The delicate, lyrical sections were heartbreakingly tender, like a whispered confession. She wasn't performing, she was testifying. The piano, which had been merely an object of status minutes before, was now a living, breathing creature, and she was its voice. It was singing of injustice, of resilience, of beauty found in the most unlikely of places. Alistair Finch, the jaded critic, was leaning forward in his chair, his whiskey forgotten. His eyes, which had been clouded with boredom, were now wide and alight with the look of pure, unadulterated discovery. He was witnessing not a performance, but a revelation. He was seeing the birth of an artist. The final, thunderous chords of the ballade crashed through the ballroom, a wave of triumphant defiance. Elara held the final note, letting it hang in the air, its vibration seeming to touch every person in the room. Then, it faded, and the silence that returned was different. It was not empty. It was full of awe, of wonder, of a truth that had just shaken the very foundations of the room. For a long moment, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then, a single sound broke the spell. A slow, deliberate clap. It was Mr. Finch. He was on his feet, his hands coming together in a steady, powerful rhythm. His face was etched with an emotion Elara had never seen on any of the guests, genuine reverence. His clapping was a signal. The spell was broken, and the ballroom erupted. It was not the polite, dutiful applause Victoria had received. It was a roar. It was a standing ovation of people who had been genuinely, profoundly moved. They were applauding not the maid's daughter, but the artist. They were applauding the music. Real and raw, and utterly undeniable. Elara opened her eyes. Looking out at the sea of faces, dazed, she saw her mother near the back wall, tears streaming down her face, her hands pressed to her mouth, her eyes shining with a fierce, brilliant pride. That was the only applause that truly mattered. Mr. Finch began to walk toward the dais, his presence parting the crowd like a ship through water. He completely ignored the still frozen Mrs. Vance. He stepped onto the dais and approached Elara, who was now standing, looking small and overwhelmed by the massive instrument. In 60 years of listening to music, he said, his voice quiet, but carrying through the now hushed room, I have heard that piece played by the world's greatest virtuosos. I have heard it in London, in Vienna, in Moscow, but I have never, ever, heard it played with that much honesty, with that much soul. He looked at her, his gaze intense. What is your name, young lady? Elara, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Elara, he repeated, tasting the name. He then turned to the assembled guests. Tonight, you were all expecting a performance. Instead, you have been given a gift. You have witnessed the truth. This is what music is. Not pedigree, not training, not status. It is this. He gestured toward Elara. The humiliation on Mrs. Vance's face was a terrible thing to behold. It was not loud or dramatic, but a slow, silent crumbling of her entire world. The gala that was meant to cement her family's status had become the stage for her maid's daughter's triumph. The guests, who moments before had been seeking her favor, were now looking at Elara with awe, their whispers now about the prodigy in the uniform. The spotlight she had so carefully engineered for her own daughter was now shining with blinding intensity on the one person in the room she had considered invisible. Later that night, long after the last guest had departed in a state of bewilderment and excitement, Sarah and Elara stood in Mrs. Vance's study. The vast, silent house felt different now, charged with the memory of what had happened. Mrs. Vance sat behind her large mahogany desk, looking small and defeated. She couldn't meet their eyes. Her gaze was fixed on a letter opener on her desk. I assume you're here to tender your resignation, she said, her voice flat, devoid of its usual authority. Yes, Mrs. Vance, Sarah said, her own voice calm and steady. For the first time in 20 years, she was not speaking as a servant to her employer. She was speaking as a mother, standing beside her daughter. There was a long silence. Mrs. Vance finally looked up, her eyes landing on Elara. There was no anger left in them, only a deep, hollow confusion. It was the look of someone who had built her life on a foundation of lies, the lie that worth was determined by birth, that value was determined by wealth, and had just watched it all turn to dust. That piano, she said, almost to herself. My grandfather bought it. It's been in our family for 100 years. It was never yours, Elara said softly, her first words to her employer that evening. It belongs to the music, Mrs. Vance had no reply. There was nothing left to say. Sarah and Elara turned and walked out of the study of the grand house and into the cool night air. As they walked down the long driveway, leaving the glittering prison behind them, Sarah took her daughter's hand. It was a hand that had scrubbed floors and polished silver, but it was also a hand that had tamed a beast of ebony and ivory and made it sing a song of truth. They didn't look back. They were walking away from a world of gilded cages and toward a future that was as vast and unknown and full of promise as the music that was still ringing in their hearts. A future that had been earned not by inheritance, but by a talent that had refused to remain silent. In a world that often measures a person's worth by their status, their wealth, or the name they carry, we sometimes forget the undeniable power of truth. Elara's story is a reminder that true talent, real passion, cannot be contained by prejudice or confined by circumstance. It is a fire that, given the smallest flicker of opportunity, will burn bright enough to illuminate the darkest corners and expose the hollowness of pride. Her victory wasn't just for herself. It was for every voice that has ever been silenced, every dream that has been dismissed. It proves that the most powerful thrones are not inherited, but earned, and that sometimes, the most profound justice is found not in a courtroom, but in the silence that follows a single perfect note. If you were moved by this story of hidden power and the triumph of the human spirit, please subscribe to our channel. Join our community for more tales that challenge the powerful, uplift the deserving, and prove that truth will always find its voice.